Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. So, students, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Professor Sutirth Dey, who is going to speak on the topic of evolution of dispersal, the Drosophila story. Sir is a PhD in population ecology from JNCASR. There is Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, Bangalore. After his BSc Zoology and MSc in Environmental Biology from the University of Delhi. He has this research interest in theoretical and empirical population dynamics and evolutionary ecology. So, he's expert in ecology and evolution, biostatistics, and I'm happy to announce that he's the founder and coordinator of Mimamsa. There is a 2-day All India Science Quiz, which is considered to be the toughest of its kind in India. Talking about its awards, Professor Dey is a university gold medalist from University of Delhi for securing first class in MSc Environmental Biology. He stood first in All India entrance exam for admission to Department of Environmental Biology and has been awarded the best thesis in biological sciences. Professor Dey is also awarded the Young Scientist Medal by the Indian National Science Academy, New Delhi, and has also won several awards for debates, example, and has given many talks on All India Radio for various science-related projects. Right. Last but not the least, Professor Dey has written and directed an English film that is Yours. It's called YOURS, which was staged at JRD Tata Auditorium at the National Institute of Advanced Studies at Bangalore.
Sir.
Okay.
So which topic now we are taking?
Okay, the topic is evolution of dispersal, that is the Drosophila story. So let's hear directly from Professor Dey. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Although my topic per se is going to be dispersal evolution, what I really want to talk about is, what exactly is it like to be a scientist? So all of you, since you are in the Inspire camp, I'm assuming that you have some interest in science. I'm assuming that at least some of you want to become a scientist when you grow up, when you get your PhDs and so on and so forth, right? But have you really thought about what is it that makes, differentiates between, let's say, a student of science versus a scientist? What do you think? By the way, this particular thing, I don't want it to be like a talk. This is going to be a lot of interaction. So, this will work only when you guys answer my questions either directly or, in the chat box. And once I start showing the presentation, then I won't be able to see the chat box. So at that point, you guys will have to shout whatever you have in your mind. Okay. So yeah. So what is the difference between, let's say, a scientist and a student of scientist? Yeah, Soham, go on. So people who want to say something, please, put up your hands. So there is something called reactions at the bottom of your screen. Right. If you go there, you will see raise your hand. You can use that method. Yeah, Soham, go on.
Actually, I think the difference between a student of science and a scientist is that a scientist actively works in an organization and working on something different, and a science student is studying the basics of science, as in what has already been taught, discovered.
Okay. So what Soham is saying is that you will be called a scientist if and only if you formally work in an organization and you do something new.
If and only if we work in a formal organization, but Like if we work on something on a particular field in science and we do more and more research on that topic.
So you are a scientist if you are doing research. Is that what you are saying? Okay, think about it. Anybody else has another answer? Yeah, Riddhi, please speak up. Speak up.
So a science student may be the one who studies whatever is already discovered.
Mhm.
And a scientist is the one who looks for research and want to dive more in science and makes like those whatever the science things are there, like theories, whatever practicals, he will research them. New
So
research.
what do you mean by the word research?
Research means discovering new things.
Discovering new things, right? So what you are saying is that scientist is one who is trying to come up with new things, whereas a student of science is one who is already reading the things that are there, right? Yeah, Kadam?
Yes, maybe.
Fair enough.
But a
Kadam?
scientist is more experienced than a science student.
That's not necessarily true. As a matter of fact, you won't believe it. When you become a scientist, you read a lot more than what you read as students. Okay, I am a professional scientist, and trust me, I spend more hours with my books and other things than you guys do at this stage in your life. Okay, so reading is lifelong. Yeah, Kadam, you wanted to say something? Yashika, Kadam.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have two questions. The first means, what is difference between science and biology?
We will take those questions later, okay? Because if I take those questions right now, then what I'm going to discuss with you, that will get derailed. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So I'll take these kind of questions right at the end. So right now you guys answer my question, difference between a scientist and a science student. All right.
Okay, sir. So
Difference of age, huh?
Yeah, so from which class do you like to, means you want to be a scientist? From which year?
No. Yashika, you are getting this wrong. This is not the question answer session in which you will ask the question and I will answer that. Okay. It is the reverse part right now. Right now, I will ask the question and you guys answer that question. And in the process of that question and answer, we will get to something. All right. So all these kind of personal questions, you leave it for the end. Okay. Is that clear, Yashika?
Okay, sir.
Good. So good. I think we have some answers. You guys can put your hands down. Okay. So what I will now do is I will take you to my PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint gives a different title. Don't worry about that. Okay. I will come back to the title that I actually gave to these organizers. Yeah. Can you see my screen properly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. So the difference between a science student and a scientist is pretty much what some of you said. One of them is producing new stuff. The other is consuming what others have already produced. Now, just a graphical way of understanding this thing can come from this thing. Okay, so what you have over here, you can identify this, right? These are Shiva statues. And although all of them are Shiva statues, you can see that they are made in different forms. They are, this is a Shiva Parvati statue, this is a dancing Shiva statue, and this is a meditating Shiva statue. And if you are into sculpture, then you should also realize that these are also made out of different things. So this is, as you can perhaps make out, this is a stone statue. Can anybody tell me what this is made of? Most likely.
This, sir, I think metal.
Bronze. Yes, it's a bronze statue.
Sir, copper.
Bronze, not copper, bronze. Okay. And this is most probably made out of plaster and some
cement, sir.
Cement, yeah. Now, Okay, people, can you turn off your mics? There's a lot of noise there. Samir Kulkarni, can you turn off your mic? Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. So, if you just want to view these statues and you want to, go wow and, like and super like and all that, then the way you do it is something different. On the other hand, suppose I tell you that I want you to make a Shiva statue. Okay. So if you want to make a Shiva statue, then what are the various things that you are going to need? Quickly.
Sir, sculpting tools and the basic
Tools.
materials like what we need to
raw
make
material.
yes, the material
Tool, raw
which
material.
want
Yes.
the
And
and some paints if necessary, or we can mainly the material on which we have to make a statue.
And the picture of the statue
May
or
I?
Yeah.
guide.
Yes,
okay.
how the statue should look like.
Yeah.
Okay, which is called the idea of the statue in some sense.
Should
The
have an
concept.
idea how the statues look like. We can't
Exactly.
have a statue of some different person.
Exactly. So, as you pointed out, you need 3-4 different things, right? You need the raw materials. You need the tools. Will raw material and tool alone be sufficient? You will also need the idea of the statue. That is true. What else are you going to need?
So
Time. Lot of time.
Okay, fair enough. Time is needed for pretty much everything.
patience to make the statue.
Yeah, okay. Time, patience. But there is something way more critical than that. What is that?
Perfection.
Knowledge.
Not perfection. Perfection is there for everything, isn't it? Even when you are cooking, you need knowledge of what?
Craftsman.
Exactly. What you are also going to need is the ability to use the tools on the raw materials, what is known as skill. Okay. You might have, looked at certain statues and you would have said, wow, kitna badhiya banaya hai, how beautiful it is. Whereas there are other statues at which you look at it, I can recognize it as a Shiva statue, but it's not very well made, right? The difference between the two very often is about the skill with which the sculptor has made the statue. So you need a lot of skill. And then, of course, on top of all this, you need creativity and you need a sense of aesthetics. Only when all these things come together do you get something like the Chola Nataraj. You know this is the Chola Nataraj, right? So only then you get something as beautiful as this. Turns out that when you are becoming a producer of knowledge, when you are becoming a scientist, okay, first of all, not all knowledge production happens in science. Knowledge production can happen in many different areas. So suppose when a historian is studying the records of past and essentially trying to create a picture of the Mughal era or trying to create a picture of Central America in the 1900s, then that person is also creating knowledge. However, in the context of this talk, I'm only going to talk about knowledge production in the context of science. And even there, you need your raw materials, which typically are some major biological observations. You are going to need some tools. They can be either cells or computers or other organisms or some kind of techniques, whatever. You need quite a bit of skill. Okay. And honestly, the entire education that you are having, that a large part of that is towards the development of these skills. And then you need to be able to use that skill in creative ways. And you need to be able to interpret your data. And only when you do all that, do you become a scientist. When all these things come together, that's when you convert
Sir, you are not audible.
Yes,
Yes,
you're
sir,
not
your
audible.
voice is not coming.
Yes, sir, your voice is not clear.
No, sir.
No.
So we can't hear you.
Sir, your voice is breaking.
Hear me now, people?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
You can hear me now, na? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Just one second. Great. So all is good, right? You can hear me. Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
sir, we can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Suddenly, for reasons that I have no idea, my mic failed. So anyway, so what we are going to do today, this is the topic that I had given, is I'll take one study which we did in our lab, and I will use this study to illustrate these various basic components of science and show you how scientists actually go about going from whatever the raw materials and the tools all the way to some conclusion. Now, the reason I have chosen a topic from my own lab is not because I think it is the best. I obviously enjoy it, that's a different ballgame. But the reason I'm taking this topic is because this is something that I am very intimately aware of. This is something where I can actually show you, how things happen step by step and so on. Okay. So we are going to talk about dispersal. Anybody has any idea what is dispersal?
I think it is something to do with the shape of the organism, like how long or short it is.
No.
Dispersal means spreading things of one's kind.
Dispersal basically means movement. Okay, it is associated with movement. And in order to remember, I said that the raw material in research is the observation, the biological observations with which you start. Okay, so the raw material over here is the phenomena of dispersal. And in order to understand why dispersal is important, we need to start somewhere, some observations about nature. All of us know that our nature, there is tremendous amount of biodiversity. There are millions of life forms, and unfortunately, many of these life forms are under severe threat due to human activities and due to climate change. And as a result of these two things, we know that when the animals are lucky, this is what they face. Now, can you tell me what is it that I am showing over here?
Deforestation.
Not only deforestation, there is something more than that.
Sir, they have planted some. They have made a specific place, which is not.
This is what you are seeing right now is called habitat fragmentation. Okay, so suppose you have a continuous habitat, and then there is human movement, human activity. Can you see my cursor over here on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Deforestation.
So because of that thing, deforestation is simply cutting down of forest. When you cut down forest, that is deforestation. But what I'm showing you over here is something slightly more nuanced, which is deforestation happening in such a way that you have certain areas of forest or certain areas of habitat which are surrounded by larger areas where there is no habitat. So as a result, what will happen to all those populations or all those organisms which are trapped in this area? All of them, they have a very limited area in which they can live. They have very limited access to resources. And if they try to come out of this, they are going to get killed, right? So this leads to a special kind of problem. As I said, this is called habitat fragmentation. But this happens when the organisms are lucky. When they are not so lucky, what they experience is this: mass destruction of the habitat. And when that happens, it is obvious that these populations, they are going to go extinct. Now, when faced with these kind of disturbances, the first line of defense for most organisms is to run away. Obviously, this is only true for those organisms which can move around, the so-called mobile organisms. And therefore, dispersal, which is movement from one place to another, this is what allows those organisms to survive, or when they are faced with negative environments or harmful environments. Now, because of this, it is thought that many organisms will be able to survive in the world only when many organisms will be able to survive in the wild only when they are becoming better dispersed. So the definition of dispersal is any movement of individuals because of which there is a gene flow, okay, because of which the genetic composition of the population changes. Why is this important? So suppose you get up in the morning and you go to the market. Now, obviously you have moved, okay, or let's say you go from your house to the school and then you come back. Now, obviously you have moved. Will that be called dispersal? So by this definition, it will not be called dispersal because it does not change the genetic composition of your population. So only those movements which change the genetic composition of a population, those are the ones which are technically called dispersal. And as I pointed out, this is very, very important because this allows organisms to be in favorable environmental conditions, and that is how it increases their survival probability. There are many other ecological contexts, range expansion, species invasion. If you don't know about these concepts, it doesn't really matter. Basically, what you need to understand over here is that dispersal, the process of dispersal, is a very critical process in an ecosystem for a population. Now, because as I said, because of climate change, many organisms will be able to survive if and only if they are able to become better and better dispersal. And that is why what will happen when dispersal evolves and what are the conditions under which dispersal evolves, this is a very, very big question in the field of ecology. Okay, for the last several decades, people have been researching this question in a very detailed manner. However, if you think about it closely, this doing research on dispersal is actually a pretty tough job. Why? That is because dispersal, it's a very complex process. Now think about it. We said that dispersal is when one organism moves to another population and becomes a part of that population. Now, in order for the organism to move, the organism has, there are multiple steps in the whole thing. The first step is that the organism has to decide that I have to move. Once the organism has decided that it will move, it actually has to move. And that actual movement is not easy. Why? Because in many cases, that movement will happen through terrains which are not favorable for the organism. They might end up experiencing serious stress, or they might even have very high potential of dying during the move. And then once the organism has completed the movement and it has arrived at a new place, at a new habitat, most likely that new habitat is not going to be empty. There are other organisms who are going to be there. And obviously those organisms will not be very happy with people coming from outside, because they will end up reducing the amount of resources that are available to the natives. Therefore, there is always a tension between the migrants and the native individuals of a place. And therefore, the migrants, okay, please remember, I'm talking all these in the context of non-human species. Okay, when it comes to humans, these are obviously very big problems, and they have very different social, political, economic, moral, all other kinds of issues. I am only talking about non-human organisms. So when these migrant organisms, they reach a new place, then they have to be able to compete with the natives and establish themselves in the new area. Obviously the new area will have a slightly different environmental conditions, slightly different food availability. So they have to be able to get used to this new area and so on. So all these steps need to happen one after the other. Only then will dispersal be successful. Now think about it. The kind of traits that we are talking about here are very different kinds of traits. So for example, for emigration, for moving out, the organisms, they have to take a decision. So it's a behavioral trait. The movement part of it, they have to withstand stress. They have to withstand predators. So those are more physiological kind of traits. Whereas when they go somewhere and they have to establish themselves over there, partly there has to be a lot of aggression, so that they end up displacing the natives, or at least competing with the natives. And partly there also has to be a lot of adaptability to the conditions which exist at the new. So all these are very, very different kinds of things, all of which the organism needs to be able to do in order to become a successful disperser. Therefore, since these are very different kinds of things, the constituents, people for a long time argued that dispersal may not even be an evolvable trait. Okay, dispersal. So if you want to see whether dispersal evolves or not, then the only way for you to do that is through some kind of a selection. Okay, some kind of a process by which you will only select those organisms which are better dispersed, right? So let's think about it from first principle. You want to study dispersal, you want to see whether dispersal evolves or not, and therefore you need to come up with a method by which you will select only those organisms which are better dispersed. How will you do that?
So can you repeat the question?
I want to see whether dispersal evolves or not, right? Now, what do I mean by dispersal evolving? I mean that if every generation I somehow are able to separate those organisms which are better dispersers, and then I allow only those organisms to breed for the next generation, then over time I will have better dispersers. That's what is dispersal evolution, right?
Yes.
So come up with a process by which you will be able to separate the non-dispersers from the dispersers, or the better dispersers from the poor dispersers. How will you do that?
Yeah, sir, you showed that block of forest in the surrounded by a plain field. So how we select is basically there are organisms in that part of the that selected block, and these organisms, if they want to survive, they will eventually move to the bigger forest area, and these animals can be selected as organisms with better dispersal.
Correct, absolutely correct. However, if you try to actually do that, you will get into a problem. What is the problem that you will get into? The problem is that most of these organisms, particularly if they are slightly big organisms, they take a very long time to develop, and then they will take a long time to come out of that place, right? So basically, and see, that picture that I showed you was from a very, very top view. Okay, it's almost like a drone view, or actually even almost like a satellite. Now that area can be hundreds or thousands of square kilometers, right? So in order to study this, you will actually have to track all those organisms which are moving out, and then you have to do it generation after generation, right? So what will happen? You will need an enormous amount of time, you will need an enormous amount of patience, and obviously a lot of money. So If you do it in the forest, you have a problem. So if you want to make things faster, remember, science is also about being practical. If you want to make things faster, what will you do? What kind of a system will you study it in?
Like put a bunch of animals into an enclosed area and let them fight it to the death.
Yes, but then what you are selecting for is fighting ability, right? But you need to select for dispersal.
Yes.
Then you are selecting for the wrong thing, correct? So then basically you need a system where you can do exactly what Soham said, but you can do it more easily and you can do it faster, and you want to do it for some organism in which the process is going to be fast. Okay, so here are the questions that you need to ask. First of all, how are you going to study this? Are you going to study it theoretically, or are you going to study it in the lab, or are you going to study it in the field? I just now told you what are the problems of studying it in the field, right? Too large, too long, so on. Studying it in theory, will it be useful? Using mathematical equations? What do you think?
Properties of the organism.
Yeah, using mathematical equations. And the kind of equations, for example, that you use in physics. Can you do that?
I think so.
No, it will become very, very difficult. It will become close to impossible. The reason is I started by saying that dispersal is a complex process. There are too many things involved in dispersal, right? So obviously, studying it theoretically using all the equations, you don't even know what the equations are. So studying it theoretically becomes close to impossible. So if you want to study this in a reasonably short amount of time, the best bet that you have is in the lab. But if you are studying it in the lab, then what should be the properties of the organisms that you want to use?
It should be small.
They have to be small, because if they're in the lab and if they're large, then obviously, you will run out of lab space. Good. They should be small. What else should they be?
These organisms should be well fed.
Yes, but that is in your hand. You will feed them. What else?
Short lifespan.
Able to store them.
Yes, they should be easy to store. Yes, absolutely so.
They should have the ability to move.
They should have the ability to move. Absolutely. Obviously, you are
Short lifespan.
Why short lifespan?
For more number of observations.
Exactly. They need to have short lifespan. Correct. So can you think of some organisms? Now
Bacteria, E. coli.
E. coli will not move, right?
Ants, sir.
Ants is a very good thing. What else?
Plasmodium.
Plasmodium is a parasite inside your cell, right?
Oh, sorry, not Plasmodium. I meant Paramecium.
Paramecium is a possibility. People have actually done it using paramecium. Very good. So now you guys are getting the hang of it, right? The kind of questions that you ask. So the ones that we ended up using is this one.
The presentation is 20.
सर तुमसे वॉइस आवाज नहीं आता.
Are you not able to hear the sound?
No, no, sir.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Sorry. अरे बोलना था ना. My mistake. My mistake.
Small
Can you
fly,
hear the sound
big
now?
impact.
Yes, sir.
Part 1.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Why the
thank you.
fly? Drosophila melanogaster, known more commonly as the fruit fly or vinegar fly. Familiar to 5 Nobel Prizes to date. Having been studied intensively for over 100 years, it's the subject of around 100,000 scientific papers. But why are so many so eager to study this tiny fly? And how did it become so important? Let's take a quick look at their history. Originating from equatorial Africa, fruit flies became cosmopolitan, following human culture all over the world. They made their debut in the US in the second half of the 19th century, first reported emerging from a jar of pickled plums. Back then, Charles Darwin's controversial theory of evolution was being debated around the world, and scientists wanted to test Darwin's ideas experimentally. One of them was Thomas Hunt Morgan. He wanted to study evolution by reproducing it in the laboratory. Fruit flies were perfect for the job. They're easy to catch and have a fast life cycle. A fly can become a grandparent in as little as 20 days, making experiments much quicker than in more complex animals. Their small size means that you could fit the entire population of London on a few lab trays. And they're cheap and easy to keep, which means they're also suited to the scientist on a budget. And so the fly began a very successful career in Morgan's lab in 1906. Capitalizing on their advantages, Morgan began breeding flies in huge numbers to test some of the ideas around Darwin's theories. When one day, he spotted a fly with white eyes instead of the usual vivid red. This moment would transform modern biology. You see, these white eyes represented a mutation of a gene that was inherited and turned out to be located on a chromosome, bringing together previously unlinked theories of the time. This brought to light important explanations for evolution and seeded new fields of research. The era of genetics began, and over the next few decades, flies taught us how genes are inherited and are arranged on chromosomes, and how different mutations interact and influence each other. Around the middle of the 20th century, fly researchers began turning their microscopes to eggs and maggots too, so they can now study mutations that are often lethal in later development. These developmental studies using Drosophila genes, together with the discovery of DNA, the genetic code, and gene technology, enormously helped unravel how genes actually contribute to biological functions and what can go wrong in disease. Nobel Prize-winning Drosophila research, led by Ed Lewis, Christiane Nusslein-Volhard, and Eric Wieschaus, made the enormous power of this approach unmistakably clear. Through studying development, they used sophisticated fly genetics to pick apart the fundamental processes by which body structures are formed. But why should we care about the biology of a simple fruit fly? It turns out that humans share a surprising amount.
Thank you. Anyway, so now after this goes into all the genetics of Drosophila and so on. The point I wanted to make was that Drosophila is important not only because it ticks all the boxes, being small, being fast, and so on, but also because Drosophila, in terms of the genetics, we know a lot about its genes. So we'll come to that in a moment.
Sir, we have in the exam on this year, we have DNA, and we actually were learning about how the fruit fly has 8 pairs.
Right. No, fruit flies, if you are in biology, you cannot escape fruit flies. Somewhere or the other, you will have to learn about it. But now comes the skill question. So the raw material is there. You have your question, you have your system, but now you want to make the flies evolve for increased dispersal. How will you do that?
Controls should be...
No, we'll come to the controls later. First, answer the first question. How will you make the flies evolve for increased dispersal?
We will give them like a tank or a lab like a enclosed environment where they can thrive, where they have all of the things they could ever want in life. And
But then where is the selection for dispersal coming from? If they
If
have
they are
everything,
breeding,
comfortable, if they're not comfortable with the place they are, then they will disperse.
exactly. So basically, you need to take them in a place where they're not comfortable. Some of them will disperse. Only the ones.
Also, sir, if
Hmm?
there is no scope of dispersal for them, they will have mutations.
No. Wait a second. If they have no scope for dispersal, then you can't select for dispersal, isn't it? So you have to give them some scope for dispersal, number one. Number two, if they have no scope for dispersal, then they will have mutation is a problematic thing, because mutation is always happening randomly. Okay. So whether you give them scope or not,
Okay,
mutation
sir.
will always happen. That's a different one.
sir, if we like take 100 flies and out of them we put them in an uncomfortable environment and we connect that uncomfortable to a comfortable environment, and then like 20 flies migrate to the environment and they are the chosen ones, so we allow them to.
Exactly. That's exactly what we ended up doing. Okay. And the setup that we ended up using was something like this. So what we did was we actually went to the market and we purchased these bottles. You can see these plastic bottles, right? These are the kind of stuff that you have a cap on top of it, this thing. And then this is where you store your atta, dal, and so on and so forth. We purchased those. We cut one end open, and to that end, we attached a funnel. Can you see the funnel over here? Okay. And then this source, this is what we call the source. And then we had a similar thing, which we call the destination. And then this source and destination, they were connected using a pipe, a simple pipe. This is the kind of pipe, you know what is called the leveling tube. So when the carpenters, they work, they use these kind of plastic tubes for seeing whether your whatever surface is level or not. Okay. Kind of simple plastic tube. So this doesn't matter too much. So we had a control population, and from there we selected two, made two different sets. So this is a schematic of the whole thing. So this is that source tube, source bottle. And in this bottle, as somebody pointed out, we put flies. We didn't put 100, we put a lot more. We put about 2,400 flies. And then this was connected via that pipe that I showed you to another bottle, which we call the destination. Now, we said that this environment needs to be uncomfortable. So in this particular case, how do you make it uncomfortable? So what we did was, we didn't give any food, we didn't give any water over there. Now these flies, they can live without food for quite some time, but without water, within about 6 hours or so, they start dying. So within about 2 hours, it becomes very, very uncomfortable for them, and they start moving around in this entire area, trying to find an escape path. Now, once it has found that escape path, then the fly has to make a decision. We know that no food is coming, no water is coming, but they don't know that. So some of them can decide that, okay, we will stay back and hope that water will come. And some of them can take a call that, no, we don't know what's going to happen. We will just run. So this is what happens. The flies move through the path. They reach the destination part. Not all of them reach. Some of them, die in this middle only. And we wait till about 50% of them have reached here, or 6 hours have passed, whichever happens earlier. Why 6 hours? Because after 6 hours, they will start dying. So this is, and these ones, the ones which are reaching here, these are the ones which are allowed to breed for the next generation. And this process keeps on happening generation after generation. Okay. So this is how the selection is happening. Now remember, for every experiment, we need a control, right? So what is going to be the corresponding control over here?
Another like batch of flies.
Yes, but
they are put in a like a comfortable environment.
See, what is the definition of a control? A control is everything that is happening in your treatment except one. Okay, so they should differ from the treatment in exactly one parameter, and that parameter's effect is what you are studying. So in this particular case, we are studying the effect of dispersal, correct? But in order to induce the dispersal, we are actually making them feel thirsty over here. So what will be our control?
Make source comfortable.
No. If you make the source comfortable, then there will be two things will happen. The source will be comfortable, so they have comfort and they are not dispersed.
We will do just the opposite. A destination will not have the food and water, and the source will have food and water.
See, if the source has food and water, then they have no reason to come out to begin with, right? Now, remember, what is it that you are studying? What is the control? That's the question. Okay. Now think about it. Here in this setup, two things are happening. A, the flies are becoming uncomfortable over here, and B, they are dispersing through this pipe, correct?
Yes.
Now,
Yes,
what
sir.
is it that we are trying to study? We are trying to study the effect of dispersal, correct? So this extra bit about the flies becoming uncomfortable is our nuisance parameter. In other words, we are not interested in these flies becoming uncomfortable, but we have to make them uncomfortable so that they disperse. Otherwise, they won't disperse, isn't it? Now, suppose evolution has happened. I can always come back and say, hey, whatever result you are getting it because you made the flies uncomfortable over here. They have nothing to do with your dispersal.
Sir, we will just keep on a batch of flies just there so we can observe the difference between the flies that have migrated and not.
Exactly. Precisely. That is what our control was. You put the flies in that, exactly this kind of a bottle. The flies are desiccated for the same length of time as these flies, but there is no opening for them to go anywhere. So there is no dispersal happening, which means you are taking, allowing everybody to pass their genes to the next generation. Okay, you get how that is the control?
Yes,
People,
sir.
is this clear, or do you want me to explain this again?
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Okay. So what we did was we allowed this to happen over many, many generations. And when we started, the distance of this path was just 2 meters. Okay. And when we started, these guys, they could on an average move about 4 meters. However, each generation, every few generations, we increased the distance or the length of this pipe. So now each generation, they had to travel longer and longer and longer to reach the destination. By the time when we started, the difference was 2 meters. After 69 generations, this difference was 20 meters. And this experiment is still continuing in our lab. After about 100 generations, this difference is 62 meters. Okay, now just think about it. When they started, they could move only about 4 meters. Today, they are moving 62 meters. That's a 15 times increase in how much they can move. Okay, all this has happened within a space of about 5-6 years or so inside the lab. So this thing where we are increasing the distance that they have to travel in order to reach the destination, this is analogous to increasing habitat fragmentation, increasing the distance between the habitats where they have to travel longer and longer. So now that you have done your selection, how do you know that anything has really happened? What is it that you are going to measure?
I think we take like a sample of the flies and sample of the flies that have reached the destination, and we compare it to the flies from the original source. So we can take like a sample from generation 50 and compare it to sample from generation 1, and we can check the difference.
Ideally, that is how you should do it. But there is a problem with flies, which is they die. So by the time they have hit generation 50, nobody from generation 1 is still alive. And we do not have a way, unlike in bacteria where we can preserve them, we do not have a way of preserving flies over time. Okay. So what you said is right, but we won't compare generation 50 with generation 1. We will compare generation 50 of selected with generation 50 of control. Remember, the controls are not dispersing, right?
Yeah. So So generation 50 will have less mutations compared to generation 50 of control will have less mutation compared to generation.
Why do you say so?
Because these control flies are more comfortable and they aren't being dispersed.
So what? Why should they have less mutation then?
Because they aren't facing any hardship.
You are assuming that when you face more hardship, you have more mutation, right?
So they adapt to the new environment.
That doesn't mean more mutation. See, this is the first thing that you have to understand about the nature of mutation. Mutations do not arise because you are facing hardship. Mutations arise what is known as random to fitness. They arise at a basic rate all the time. If by chance they happen to be in an environment where that mutation is favored, their frequency in the population will go up. But under no situation will you have a case where mutation is happening because you need the mutation. Okay. This particular statement that I said, this is a Nobel Prize. It's a 1955 Nobel Prize. Luria and Delbruck got their Nobel Prize by showing exactly this, that mutations arise irrespective of whether you need them or not. Okay. So this is how we measured our dispersal. This is what our dispersal selection setup also looks like. So what you see over here, these are the dispersal destinations. Okay, so we are showing you from the reverse side. These are the destinations, and you see the pipes. So the flies are supposed to walk through those pipes, and these over here are the sources, these ones. Okay, and we'll show you a close-up just to show you the flies. And you see the flies, this small dot. All right. So I'm slightly going short on time. So I'll go a little fast just to show you guys the main results that we got. So we ended up, this is just a zoom in of those things to show that in order to measure how much the flies were dispersing, we actually divided this path into small sections. And then we counted how many flies were in each section after a certain amount of time. So we measured two different components, what fraction of the flies are dispersing and how much they are dispersing. And within 10 generations, we were able to see, so these are the controls, these are the selected, we were able to see that within 10 generations, the fraction of the population that is dispersing and how far they are dispersing, both of them were increasing. So this was happening when they had food, when they had no food in the source, so they were under stress. So then we said, what happens if we now put food over there? So we have put food, we have put water, so everything is comfortable. These flies don't even need to disperse. And to our utter surprise, we found that once they have evolved, after that, even if you put food, they will still run, which means that this, even if there is no proximate reason for them to disperse, even they will run, and dispersal has become constitutive. Then this part we don't really need to get into. This is about the distribution. There are some very nice theoretical results that we were trying to prove here. But then comes the second big question. What are the correlates of dispersal evolution? Which means, fine, dispersal has evolved. What else has evolved? Now think about it. Dispersal means movement. Movement is a highly energy intensive thing, right? But the amount of energy that is available to organisms, that amount of energy is very limited. So if you are putting in a lot of energy into movement, then that means you are going to run into energy shortage, correct? So if you are getting into energy shortage, then what will happen to the flies?
They will die.
They will die. So if they die, then what will it show up as? If you are looking at the flies, see, remember, if they simply disperse and die, then they will not be able to contribute their genes to the next generation, right? So they have to live long enough so that they lay eggs. If they don't lay eggs, then they are gone anyway. So what should get affected are things like
the next generation will be weak.
Exactly. So the two places where it should show up is how many eggs they are laying, because this is very well known that typically if you spend a lot of energy in body activity and other things, then typically the number of offspring that you can produce, number of kids that you can produce goes down. So that is technically known as fecundity. So we looked at fecundity and we figured out that there is no significant difference. And as somebody pointed out, if you are spending all your energy in running, then you will die, which will show up as a reduction in how long you live, a reduction in longevity. And as we ended up showing, there was no difference in longevity either. Now, this is a very interesting thing. Now, these traits, it is very well known from single generation studies that when dispersal happens, typically fecundity comes down, typically lifespan comes down. Now, because that is what happens in single generation studies, people in the literature always thought that that is what will happen when evolution will also happen. However, what we are showing is different. What we are showing is that just because you see certain traits, if A goes up, B goes down in a single generation study, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what will evolve when you become, when there is selection for dispersal. Now, this is something that is very counterintuitive to most people. Actually, even today, when I, present this in front of ecologists and evolutionary biologists, many of them completely get shocked at this point. However, I can't go into the theoretical underpinnings of it, but if you look at the theory, study the theory very carefully, you realize that just because something, some correlation exists between traits now, that doesn't give you a guarantee that that is what is going to happen in the future. So, for example, suppose, let's say people who have darker skin color, they are more comfortable in warmer temperature. Let's assume that. Okay. Now, from that, if you say that, okay, global warming is happening, therefore, we are going to evolve darker and darker skin tone. You cannot do that. That's the kind of statement that is routinely made in newspapers and popular fiction, but that is actually just that. That is just fiction. It doesn't happen that way. Anyway, so since many of you are interested in genes, obviously, once you have such a nice phenomena of dispersal evolving, then the question to be asked is that what is it that is happening at the suborganismal level? What genes are responsible? But now you get into a problem. What is the problem? Remember, I said that dispersal is a very complex trait. So anything going wrong can actually affect dispersal. So suppose there is a gene in which a mutation causes the organism to have diarrhea. Now, what will happen to the dispersal ability of this organism? Will it be able to disperse or not disperse? It will decrease, correct? But the point is that if that is, but the point is, then can you point at the diarrhea gene and say this is a dispersal gene? No. Not really, right?
No.
Brunda, can you mute yourself, please? Brunda? Yeah, can you mute yourself, Brunda? There is a lot of sound coming. Okay. So, therefore, for a complex trait like dispersal, it becomes very difficult to point a single gene and say that this is what is responsible for it. I mean, another example is, suppose you have a gene in your neurovascular junction. Okay, a mutation in which makes your muscles weak. Now, obviously, that mutation will also show up as a low dispersal phenotype, but that doesn't mean that that is a dispersal gene. That is why we understood that this is a polygenic trait, multiple genes are involved, and there was not much point in looking at the gene. So we collaborated with these two people. They are from IISER Mohali. This is Professor Kavita Durai. This is her student Navdeep Gugna. And we did what is known as 1D and 2D NMR spectroscopy. Okay, if you know about NMR, great. If you don't know about NMR, just read up Wikipedia. It's a fantastic tool. Basically, what you do is you take a fly and you just vaporize it using a very strong beam of energy. And when you vaporize it, then every component in the body of the fly gets broken into small constituent parts, and then you can detect, identify, and quantify all those materials. So that's what was done in this study. And when we did that, we found a few very interesting. First of all, things like glucose, NAD, AMP, all these levels had increased, which indicated that cellular respiration had gone up. And this is very intuitive, right? Because we are selecting for high activity, so obviously lots of cellular respiration. The second thing was that certain other amino acids, their levels had gone up, and all that, along with that, had gone up the levels of octopamine, serotonin, and dopamine. Now, you guys must have heard of dopamine and serotonin, right? What are these important for in humans?
If we have dopamine, means if we like something, then dopamine is released.
Exactly. It's a part of the reward circuit, isn't it? So, octopamine is analogous to our adrenaline. You have heard of adrenaline, right? What does adrenaline do?
It constricts the blood vessels.
And as a result of that, what happens?
We get a burst of energy.
And when is it that useful?
When we are running or doing some physical activity.
Or when you are stressed. That's why it's called the fight or flight hormone, right? So similarly, octopamine in these flies, it is known to be associated with a large number of behaviors. So these behaviors is what we studied next. So one thing that we looked at is how much they move around. So what we did was we put these flies in these small cigarette-like tubes, and then these tubes were put inside this apparatus, and these apparatus, there were two infrared beams which were cutting each other perpendicularly. So like this, this is a cross section of the tube. So each time the fly went past this, it cut these beams, and when it cut these beams, then that got recorded. So using this, we were able to see how much of activity was there in the flies. We also looked at their exploratory activity. So I'll just show you a video. So these flies, normally they tend to remain in the rim of a enclosed space. But if you keep looking at this fly, see what it does is, see, it crosses into this inner area. Whereas if you look at this one, see, now it has crossed into this inner area. Whereas if you look at this one will always just keep on going, sticking to the wall. See, again, it has crossed over. Whereas this one always sticks to the wall. It never goes away from the wall. So suggesting that these flies have greater exploratory abilities or exploratory tendency than these ones. And then you remember I said that for aggression, for dispersal to happen, those guys, once they go to a new place, they have to be aggressive. So we actually checked their aggression levels. So these are two male flies, one from control population, one from selected populations, and you can see them fighting. What they're fighting over is this female. This is a dead female, but Drosophila males don't care whether the female are dead or alive. They will fight over them anyway. You see? And you see them pushing one of them pushing the other. So this is
The flag
how.
at top seems more aggressive.
Yes. Okay. So quickly, I'll tell you what we saw. We saw that because of the change in the octopamine levels, the locomotor activity, the exploratory activity, and the male-male aggression of the selected populations had significantly gone up, suggesting that what has changed is their ability, is their behavior, rather than their life history, rather than how many babies they are producing and how long they are living. So this is what we are saying. We saw metabolomic changes at the level of the metabolomics, but there was leading to behavioral changes, but there were no changes at the level of the life. So why should you care about these results? So what we saw was that dispersal evolves rapidly without any cost. These changes, once they happen, they will remain dispersing even if they have no reason to disperse. And aggression, exploration, and activity, all these factors evolve. Now these three things, aggression, exploration, and greater activity, these are also known to be very strong correlates of invasive species. So you have heard of invasive species, right? What are invasive species?
Species that are not from a native place and they have been transported to a different environment.
And once they have reached the different environment, then they have outcompeted the native species and they have ended up basically driving them to extinction, right? Now, you know that even in India, we have lots of these species, invasive species, particularly during the recent Kerala floods. Many fishes got into the backwaters of Kerala, and it's going to be a massive, massive problem. However, what you need to understand is as follows. We always think of invasive species as coming from outside. However, what we are seeing now is that you don't need these species to come from outside. If there is greater selection for dispersal, then species which are native, they will end up evolving to have traits which will make them invasive. Now, if you are thinking of alien species becoming invasive, then you can always put controls in the border and you can always have quarantine rules and so on and so forth. I mean, every country has those kind of quarantine rules. But if they are evolving from the existing species itself, then there is absolutely nothing that you can do about it. And that means that if these studies are correct, and if the results are generalizable, then as a result of climate change, apart from all the problems that we are having related to global warming, we will also have massive issues related to invasive species taking over, which cannot be a good news for our ecosystem.
So, sir, if there are tribals and some of these tribals go to a different land and they evolve, so they get better technology, better fire, and better thing, and then they come back and they are actually more powerful than the original tribe they originated from.
True, but the point is that you are talking about humans there. And in the context of humans, a lot of fitness is actually cultural evolution related fitness. So when you talked about, learning new technology, fire and all that is cultural evolution, not biological evolution, correct? So in the context of humans, the way these things play out is very, very different. So we don't mix humans and non-humans in this context. Whatever I have said should be thought of only for non-humans. Okay, so I'm done from my side. Swapnil, are you there? How much time do we have? Can I have time for a few questions, or do I need to close now?
No, sir, you have time until 1:30, sir. You can utilize any time in this.
Oh, very good, very good. So then maybe what I'll do is I'll stop the talk now and I will take questions from the students if they have anything. And by the way, people, the talk is over. So there is nothing after this, right? It's a break, correct?
No, sir, you're the last speaker here.
So after this, it's a break, right?
The session ends for today. The camp ends for today at 1:30.
Good, excellent. So in that case, yeah, people, since the talk is over, if you don't have any further questions, feel free to push up. I will take whatever questions are there from students.
Sure, sir.
Cutting down of habitat leads to more aggression, which is not good in some or the other way. Yeah, that's a one sentence summary.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yeah, bolo.
What if we make the bees aware that there is food and water?
But there is no food and water. I mean, you are talking about the selection part, right?
Yes.
See, initially, if you make them aware before selection has happened, then they will not move. We tried that. Okay. But once, so that is why you have to select without giving them food and water. But once you have selected them without giving them food and water, after that, even if you give them food and water, even then they will not move away. Even then they will not stay. Even then they will move away.
Thank you, sir.
I had a question. Sir, why did you choose fruit flies? Why not ants or anything like that?
So 2 or 3 things. Number one, ants are a social animal, right? So in ants, remember, it's only the queen which is reproducing, whereas everybody else is not reproducing. So genetically speaking, a given ant population actually has a very little variation. So there won't be much selection happening on it.
Okay.
What is the importance of researching about this? अरे यही तो समझा रहा था यार. See, what we showed is that if dispersal evolves, then species can become more invasive. Okay. Now we have shown this in the lab. Agreed. And therefore, if you take one organism and say, will it be operate, will this generalize to this particular organism? I can't give you a proper answer to that. However, remember, we have shown it in an insect, and there are a few millions of species of insects around, right? So, and another few millions of other kinds of species around. So out of those millions of species around, if even 1 or 2 species show the same response as our flies, then that is bad enough, right? And invasive species, they are a massive problem from an economic point of view, because invasive species can completely collapse your ecosystem. They can completely wipe out your agriculture. They can completely wipe out your whatever fishery or whichever thing has become invasive. So from both a development point of view as well as the economic point of view, it is extremely important to understand that climate change can also create absolute havoc in that direction. Right now, when you think about climate change, you simply think about which area will submerge underwater and which area will not. And all those people who are not submerging underwater, they think it's not our problem. But this particular thing that we're talking about, that is everybody's problem. Because after all, the climate change is affecting all habitat. Does that answer your question? If we introduce a competitive species into the same area, then a very different kind of selection will play out. Okay. If anything, the depending on how bad or good the competitor is, the rate of selection for dispersal will probably increase even further, because now they are also facing one more reason for resource shortage.
And sir, I mean, if we take a sample of flies and we basically have like 2 sets of flies, and we have the same experiment of both of them, so can there be different mutations in the different colonies?
Yes, there can obviously be different mutations because, as I said, mutations are happening randomly, right? However, many a times, actually, by the way, all this stuff that we didn't do on one population. We did it on 4 populations. Okay. And whatever results I'm showing you, they are consistent over 4 populations. So it's not that it happened just in one and not in the other. The stuff that you have to realize is that you can get the same effect through different mutations. So all of them would have increased their dispersal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have all done it through the same set of mutations. They can do it through different parts. Okay. So anything else, or shall we close for the day?
Students, anyone, any other questions for sir?
We took.
Excuse me, sir.
Bolo.
Sir, if I want to do furthermore deep study into dispersal and all the migration, so could you suggest any other book to be referred?
I will put a book in the chat box. If you ask other questions, I will give you the link to a very nice book. Okay, so I have given you the link to a very, very famous edited volume on this topic of dispersal ecology and evolution. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, sir.
This came as a direct message. I'll give it to everyone. Yeah. Yeah, you can take whatever organism that you want to. It doesn't matter. We took Drosophila because of all the issues that we said. It was easier for us to handle. That's
So, if we make the bees aware, then they won't require, means they won't use their brain more to explore. But if we won't make them aware, then they will require more, means they will require more mental skills. So, in which situation does their mental skills, means they increase?
I am not sure I understand your question. We make them aware of what?
That there is food and water on the other side. They don't need to find, they just need to go there. But in the second situation, they don't know. Then they will explore and they will use some parts of their brains that have not been used before.
Not necessarily, no. I mean, see, as I showed you, that once the evolution has happened, after that, even if you give them food and water, even then they will run away.
Sir, do they develop like a habit, like, oh, there will be food and then I go through this pipe?
See, the point is the food is not there on the other side. The other side is empty. It's only after 6 hours or 50% have reached there, that's when we transfer them to a different place with food. So it is not a cue driven dispersal. Okay, they just have to run on faith, nothing else. Okay. That is one part. I'm just trying to understand Sharyu's question about whether it increases their brain capacity in any way. I'm not so sure that it does it. Okay, it has nothing to do with brain capacity or any other cognitive skill.
Good afternoon, sir.
Okay, thank
you. Yes, Soham.
Sir, I had a doubt that you said that even if you kept food, the flies dispersed over a period of time.
Yes.
So it can lead to a conclusion that due to dispersal, there was some neurological changes.
It doesn't have to be neurological, right? So as we ended up showing, octopamine has gone up. Octopamine is a neuropeptide. And
Yes.
that, is that what you are calling a neurological change?
Yes, because normally when you keep food, the flies were not dispersed. But after the dispersal means changes and mutations.
After the evolution, yes.
Yes, evolution. Even if you get food, they kept on dispersing. So that is a neurological change. No?
Okay, it depends on how you define neurological. You are saying that increased levels of octopamine, you will classify that as neurological. Fine. If you do that, then you can call it. So can I finish, sir? Okay. Typically neurological can also mean whether there is a major change in the way the brain is wired, in the brain connections itself. Okay.
Yes.
We don't have any evidence for that. We haven't looked for it yet. All right.
Yes.
But we definitely know that the octopamine levels have changed. So that alone is sufficient to explain the observation.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Is it possible that after I mean, sir, you told that if there is, even if there is food at the source, the flies still move through the path. So is it possible that we keep the food every run and they will eventually start knowing that there is food and stop migrating?
It all depends on how we are doing the selection. So if we only allow those flies which have reached the other side to contribute to the next generation, then it will not happen. Isn't it? But if we put them in the presence of food and then we don't select the dispersers, we select, dispersers, non-dispersers, everybody, then over time, yes, you are right, there is a high possibility that this thing will go down. This is what is known as reverse evolution.
Yes. Anyone, any other questions? Please feel free to ask.
No, sir.
Sir, I had a question.
Bolo pai.
Sir, how do fruit flies multiply in such a huge number?
I mean, how does any insect reproduce? By laying eggs. So fruit fly females, they, after the first 24 hours of their lifespan, they keep on laying eggs pretty much till the end of their life. And during the initial part, they will lay some like 30-40 eggs per day. And if you give them a little bit of protein supplement, they will lay up to 70-80 eggs per day. And they live on an average for about 35 days. So just compute how many eggs they are laying. And at least under lab conditions, their survivorship is around 95%, the egg to adult survivorship. So just do a back of the envelope calculation to see how many, fruit flies can just one single female create.
So, sir, do they keep their eggs on the fruits?
In nature, yes. In nature, they lay their eggs on rotting fruit. That's why they're typically associated with fruit orchards and so on. That's why they're called fruit flies.
So, and do more male diverge or do more female diverge? And what age? Like what age and what gender?
You mean whether male disperses more or female disperses more?
Yes, sir.
I don't think there is a major difference. Okay, we actually looked at this question. Give me 1 minute. You guys ask me other things and I'll tell you the precise answer. I don't remember the precise answer right now. So in terms of how long they can go, males can go slightly further than the females in the presence of stress. But when you take out the stress, which means when you have food in the source, the trend gets exactly reversed.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sir,
Bolo.
sir, at the start, the distance that they dispersed was 2 meters, and after some time it was 62 meters, right? So how long the experiment will take place? Any fixed parameter, I mean?
We don't know. We are just blindly increasing the path length every few generations.
Yes, but it will increase with time, right?
Yeah, at some point, hopefully it will stop increasing.
Yes.
But as of now, that point has not yet reached.
Sir, but with increasing distance, as we discussed, the invasive characteristics are increasing. So don't you think that the experiment should stop?
This is happening in lab here. We are not releasing this in the environment.
What happens
right?
after the experiment is concluded? Do they just vaporize the flies?
Yeah, we kill the flies.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are other things also. So these flies, since they are highly lab adapted strains, they won't survive for more than 2-3 hours under natural condition.
Yes,
that's
sir.
a second level of fail safe that is in. But yeah, you are right. We scientists have to be very, very careful while we create all these super organisms. We
Yes,
need to
sir.
make sure that they don't come into the nature.
Yes, sir.
We are very mindful of that. Okay, chalo. I think it's 1:30. Yeah, bolo.
Can fruit flies harm human in any way?
Not that I'm aware of. Seriously, nothing that I'm aware of. They can probably lay eggs on the fruits and lead to their spoilage and all that, but that is very trivial. There is no major harm.
Do they vaporize dead flies or alive flies?
Take the alive flies and then we put them in an oven and we keep them till they are dead. Oh,
Okay,
in the context of the NMR, that's why you are asking, is it?
No, sir. You said that we vaporize it, right? So, right, in the context of NMR.
In the context of NMR, you vaporize the dead flies, obviously. But I thought in the context of what happens to them after the experiment. After the experiment is done, we put them in an oven and kill them.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Swapnil, can you close?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Day, for the precious time you are giving to our students. And apart from the topic of discussion, I, along with many, even I wasn't, knowing that such long discussion and such interesting discussion can be done on a fly as well. The session was quite interactive, and the students should learn from this that a positive social interaction, it has a wide range of benefit. Like, they increase their cognitive ability. They focus more on the interactions. Students, so you have a lot of things to learn. Even if you put the technology on one side, we understand more when a person connects, and that's what Professor could do with us. He connected well the delivery. So you get questions raise, curiosity gives you questions, and that leads to what we call, or what that leads to research. So what I believe is researching is searching again and again for something which you want to know in depth. So on behalf of the entire trust, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Sutirth Dey, and also would request him to keep guiding us in the sessions to come. Maybe next year we'll be connecting with you again, sir, for such a session.
Sure. Inspire Camp, I'm always happy to come.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See you.
Have a nice day. Have a nice day.
Yeah. See you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. So
Thank you,
students,
sir.
coming back to this thing, there are 3 questions here which we'll be asking you, and to know how much were you focused, and you are definitely, the winners will be announced next Sunday. So are you ready for it? Yes.
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 Yes, sir.
Questions, how would you like to answer? Okay. So once again, next Sunday, 19th of December, we'll be having two speakers in the camp. So we'll be having Professor B. Nagaraj from the Department of Biology, IISER, and Professor Chandrashil Bhagwat from the Department of Mathematics, wherein you will be understanding two new topics, like you understood the topic of Drosophila today, the topic of medicinal chemistry today, right? So most of you all must be unaware of such facts. We are confined to the syllabus which we have in our books and all. So let's see what new do we get to learn in biology and mathematics right from the scientists of IISER, right, next Sunday on 19th of December. Now coming to the questions, these will be three simple questions. We'll maintain a protocol of answering these questions, right? What you do is, when I ask you a question, just raise your hand. Do not speak. If you speak without raising your hand, I won't be considering those answers. Okay, so let's see if you were attentive in the entire session, in all the three sessions, as well as the video in the break, because the number went down during the video, but let's see. So the first question I have is, I don't know if you all have made notes, but I have made notes for all the three sessions here. The first question is, I'll just refer to the notes. Anyone who can tell me about why is Jocelyn Bell famous for? What remarkable contribution has Jocelyn Bell contributed in the field of science? Yes, Anuja.
Sir, Jocelyn Bell Burnell is a British astrophysicist and astronomer. She helped build a large radio telescope and discovered pulsars, providing the first direct evidence for the existence of rapidly turning neutron stars.
Okay. That's good one, Anuja. I can see one more hand raised. I could see. Shreyu, did you want to answer this question?
So it was the same.
Same answer. Good. To add on to your points, students, Jocelyn Bell is also the president of Royal Astronomical Society. Okay, so you have a lot of information. Like you can read about Royal Astronomical Society. The students who are interested in astrophysics and all, right? So this is one thing. I want the name of the female who gave us the poetic line, she sells seashells on seashore. Raise your hand. Do not speak. And do not Google the answer. You need to be sincere to yourself, students. Okay. 5 seconds more. Fine. Yes, Nikhil.
Sir, she was Mary Anning.
Great. Can you Nikhil, can you speak that statement?
What, sir?
Can you speak the statement she had given, the poetic statement which I just said?
She sells by the seashore.
Okay, that's normally a tongue twister which we use in various events, right? So today you got a lot of information regarding that. Okay, okay. Third and the last question is, I'll just okay. I want someone. Yes, Nikhil and Rehan, can you put your hands down? Yeah, thank you. My last question is, what is the scientific name for Drosophila? Yes, Anuja is the first one to raise a hand. Yes, Anuja.
So it is Drosophila melanogaster.
Good. Students, if you are attentive, along with knowing the answer, you need to be prompt as well. Yes, Anuja, Rehan, Nikhil, many of you all have raised their hands. I'm sure you'll know the answer for this. So such will be, after every session, we'll be asking you 3 questions like this. Okay, and we'll be declaring the winners. We are planning for something more. So stay tuned on the WhatsApp group. Okay, for such webinars and more informational sessions like this. Right now, apart from the session, apart from the lectures which you just heard, if you have any doubts regarding ISA, if you have any other doubts, we feel free to ask. Okay, if possible, we'll be happy to help you out right now, or else we'll get back to you with the precise answer. Anyone, any questions about the camp, about the speaker, about the about ISA?
Hi, sir.
Yes, Param.
Sir, if I want to visit Pune ISA, what will be the procedure and what requirements are there?
Okay, visit as in you want to make a career there, or you just need to see it from inside? You just want to see it from inside?
No, any. Actually, I run a small coaching, and I have children from 8th to 12th standard. So I want to show them how the ISA will be and what will be provided there.
Okay, Mr. Param, you can just type this question, and I'll just give you a number here. You can WhatsApp your question on that number. We'll be connecting to the scientists ISA and the authorized people there, and we'll be getting back to you in what can be the what will be the right path to get into ISA.
Okay.
For now,
should I type in chat?
Just to give you a first. Sorry, no, I'll just give you a number. I'll just give you a number wherein you can WhatsApp the same. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I've just given a number in the chat box. That's 9699363760. Right. So you can WhatsApp your queries on this number. Yes. Anyone? Any other questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome, sir.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see any questions coming. I hope the number is noted.
Yes, sir. I have noted. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So on this note, students, I hope the sessions were interesting and you learned a lot out of this. Similar sessions, as I have already announced, next Sunday, and you'll also be getting flyers for the same on the WhatsApp group. So stay tuned on the WhatsApp group. Do not leave it because it's for your benefit. The entire camp is not charged because it's that is the motto which Prabhu Desai Charitable Trust and Inspire Camp is all about, to reach to you all in large numbers, to inculcate the sense of scientific attitude, to give you a larger picture other than engineering and medicine, to help you all interact with scientists as you just did in the couple of hours. Okay, so it's a huge platform. Stay tuned on the WhatsApp group. For now, we'll wind up the session here. Have a nice time, all of you all. Enjoy your Sunday, intellectually, academically, or just chill out, and see you next Sunday for sure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.